The dust on Harmony Creek Lane was thick and red, kicked up every morning by Old Man Silas's Model A and settled again by the heavy, humid air of the evening. Jake sat on his porch swing, the wood groaning a familiar protest beneath him, and looked across the narrow yard to Lily's house. He didn't have much to his name, just the house his grandfather left him. A dog named Bo that mostly slept, and a beat-up acoustic guitar with a mahogany body that smelled faintly of old rosin and creek water. Every day, the sun would dip past the tall oak trees that lined the property, and the air would cool just enough to make sitting outside bearable. This was his signal. He never planned a tune ahead of time. The music just came, drawn out of him by the long shadows and the way the light caught the edge of Lily's lace curtain, where he knew she was sitting, always in the same chair, always still. He never spoke to her about it, and she never spoke to him. It was a silent conversation carried on notes of sorrow and hope, the truest kind of talk there is, and it had been their sacred routine for 2 long summers. Tonight, the air felt heavier than usual, pressing down on the chest like a confession waiting to be told. The cicadas, too, were louder, their mechanical, grinding chorus seeming to vibrate right through the floorboards. The guitar strings were old and rusted, giving the chords a certain melancholy twang that suited the lonely rhythm of Harmony Creek. Jake tuned the high E string, a sound like a tiny, tight sigh, and felt that familiar nervous flutter in his chest. It wasn't the kind of nervousness you get before a performance. This was more like the feeling you get right before you know something wonderful is about to happen, or maybe something terrible. He kept his eyes fixed on the distant line of pines on the horizon, but his heart measured its beats against the shadow on Lily's porch. He'd started playing music for Lily by accident. 2 summers ago, he'd been heartbroken, a common enough affliction in that part of the world, and was just trying to drown out the sound of his own thoughts with something louder. Lily, who had only recently moved into the old Hawthorne place next door with her ailing grandmother, had been sitting on her steps. He remembered her face clearly in the twilight, pale, serious, and framed by hair the color of midnight. He played until his fingers were raw, and when he finally stopped, she hadn't moved. The next night, she was there again, and the night after that. It became a need, a promise made without words. His music became the measure of their day. If the song was light, she'd stay a little longer. If the song was mournful, she'd eventually retreat, but never before the final chord faded. Tonight, he felt a strange urgency, a need to empty his heart entirely into the sound hole of the guitar. He pressed down hard on the frets, feeling the familiar slight sting of the steel strings, and moved the tempo a little quicker, adding a sharp, complicated chord he usually saved for when he was entirely alone. He wanted to tell her something vital, something that had been stuck in his throat for 2 years, but he didn't know the words, so the guitar had to bear the burden. The only conflict Jake ever truly faced in those evenings was the war between his longing to speak and his greater fear of breaking the spell. If he said hello, or how are you, the magic might shatter like thin porch glass. Their love, if you could call it that, was suspended, existing only in the space between the front porch pillars, carried on the vibration of the strings. This unspoken tension was the most potent ingredient of his music. He wondered sometimes what she thought of his songs. Did she hear the way he pictured her? The bright shine of her eyes, the simple elegance of her dress, the quiet patience she held like a lantern, in the rise and fall of the melody? Did she recognize the truth of his devotion in the way the bass line anchored the tune, steady and true? He played a lick that felt like running through tall grass, laughing, a feeling he desperately wished they shared. The song slowed to a near halt, a breath held too long, and then swelled again, richer and more complex, filled with the 1,000 unspoken words of 2 years. He imagined telling her how the honeysuckle scent meant she was near, or how the sound of her screen door closing was the last sound he truly heard before sleep. But the words stayed trapped behind the humming wood of the guitar, safe but useless. Tonight, he was playing the waiting song, a tune he had written late last spring when the dogwood blossoms were everywhere. It was a piece about the stillness before change, a feeling common to all people who live on the edge of the deep forest, where the darkness always feels ancient. He put a lot of himself into the piece, drawing on his memories of his mother's lullabies and the sound of the rain hitting the tin roof of the shed. But tonight, the song seemed to twist in his hands. It usually offered comfort, a gentle acceptance of the pace of life. But this evening, it felt frantic, almost desperate. He heard a note of farewell in the chords, a sound like a long journey starting at the wrong time of day. He glanced, involuntarily, toward Lily's window. The curtain was still, but the light inside seemed dimmer, and he thought he saw a shadow move near the door, a quick, jerky motion that didn't belong to Lily. The air felt charged, like a summer storm about to break, though the sky was clear and full of a pale, high moon. He shivered despite the thick heat and started to worry the melody, pushing it, hurrying it, trying to catch whatever it was that was slipping away from him in the silence. Lily, on her side of the dusty lane, wasn't just sitting. She was listening, of course, but she was also memorizing. Her grandmother, May, was asleep upstairs, exhausted from the final, heartbreaking packing that had gone on all day. The old Hawthorne house, where Lily had found a quiet harbor for 2 years, was now mostly empty, echoing with the ghosts of removed furniture. The familiar scents of ancient wood and lavender were gone, replaced by the sterile smell of cardboard and stale tape. Lily held a small, polished stone in her hand, a creek rock Jake had given her, years ago, when they were children, before the silence had become their language. She knew his waiting song by heart. She knew the exact moment he hit the high, resonant D chord that meant hope, and the low, sustained G that meant the deep, unending feeling of being alone. Tonight, however, the song had a sharp edge, like a blade that had been recently sharpened. It was beautiful, but it cut her heart. She wanted to stand up, walk out onto the porch and tell him everything. That she was leaving at dawn, that her grandmother was weaker than they let on, that his music was the only anchor she had. But the silence had become a cage of her own making, and to break it now felt like destroying the last perfect thing she had ever known. The boxes were stacked neatly in the corner of the living room, shrouded in shadow. They held the remnants of a life Lily wasn't sure she wanted to leave behind. She hadn't told Jake because she couldn't bear the thought of tainting the music with the bitterness of goodbye. Their evening ritual was pure, a slice of time outside of the world's harsh demands. If she told him she was going, Jake would stop playing, or worse, he would play a song of sadness, and that would seal the memory with too much pain. She wanted the final memory to be this, the waiting song, played with that frantic, almost desperate beauty. She imagined the notes piling up in the twilight, a rampart against the coming silence. Her grandmother, on Jake's side, he felt the music reaching its inevitable, emotional peak. He was building the song, note by careful note, into a soaring crescendo that felt like a declaration, even if he didn't know what he was declaring. He closed his eyes, let the feeling of the strings vibrating against his fingertips become his only reality, and played from a place deeper than thought. He was playing about the time Lily had laughed out loud when Bo the dog chased a butterfly, a rare, bright sound that had startled the cicadas into silence for a moment. He was playing about the way the wind moved her hair and about the 100 mornings he watched her water the wilting petunias in her flower box. He was playing the entire, unedited history of his quiet adoration. A sudden, sharp sound from across the street startled him. The distinct clack of a latch being closed, metal on metal. It broke the spell. His fingers stumbled over a difficult chord, and the note died, a harsh, flat sound that seemed to accuse him of something. He opened his eyes, heart hammering against his ribs, and saw nothing. The porch was dark, the curtain still. But the sound had been real, a small, mechanical note of finality in the soft, natural symphony of the evening. He tried to pick up the melody again, but the urgency was gone, replaced by a cold, unsettling premonition. He forced himself back into the music, but the magic was fractured. The silence that followed the final chord of the waiting song was different tonight. It didn't feel like the contented silence of a conversation concluded. It felt like a door being shut in his face. Jake rose from the swing, the chains screeching a loud, protesting echo, and walked to the edge of the porch. He stood there, boots planted on the dusty wood, and looked across the lane. The scent of honeysuckle was strong, almost overwhelming, but beneath it, he could smell something else, something sharp and industrial that reminded him of gasoline and long-haul trucking. He dismissed it as an old car passing by, but the feeling of dread persisted, clinging to the back of his neck like the humid air. He considered calling out, for the first time in 2 years, just a simple good night. But the fear was too great. What if she didn't answer? What if she wasn't there at all? The porch light was off at her house, which wasn't unusual, but the air around it was still, unnaturally so, like a tableau painted in dark colors. He walked back inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and carefully placed the old guitar back on its stand. Bo, usually oblivious, lifted his head and let out a soft, questioning whimper, looking toward Lily's house before settling back down. Even the dog sensed the shift in the deep, quiet rhythm of Harmony Creek. Lily heard the fractured note, the accidental stumble in Jake's playing, and her heart clenched. She knew he had heard the sound of the latch. It was the padlock on the storage shed, set by her cousin, Ben, who had come by earlier in the day to handle the final details. It was a utilitarian sound, a sound of conclusion, and it felt like a betrayal. She watched his shadow loom near the edge of his porch, a tall, uncertain silhouette in the faint moonlight. Her fingers tightened around the small, smooth stone. This was the moment. He was waiting. She knew his silent question was hanging in the air. Are you there? Is everything all right? If she stood up now, if she stepped into the light, the whole elaborate, 2-year-long pretense of their quiet love would collapse into a desperate, tearful conversation about moving vans and new cities. She couldn't do it. She had to let the purity of the music stand alone. She stayed perfectly still, forcing her breath to be shallow, willing the moonlight to hide her. She wanted him to remember the music, not the tears. The silence that followed his retreat was the most painful sound she had ever heard, a hollow space where the sound of the high E string used to be. The scent of honeysuckle, which had always been a scent of promise, now felt like the sharp, sweet smell of a funeral wreath. The next morning, Jake woke before the sun, which was unusual for him. The feeling of unease from the night before had not dissipated. It had curdled into a genuine anxiety. He remembered the fractured cord and the sound of the latch. He dressed quickly in his oldest pair of jeans and a thin cotton shirt, the kind of clothing people in Harmony Creek wear when they have a long, hot day of heavy thinking ahead of them. He walked out onto the porch, carrying a chipped enamel mug of strong, black coffee. The sun was just beginning to touch the tops of the highest oaks, scattering a fine gold dust over the red lane. He looked across to Lily's house, and the mug slipped a little in his hand. Everything was different. The lace curtains were gone, replaced by the bare, dark glass of the windows. The flower boxes were empty, the wilting petunias pulled out and the soil scraped clean. And sitting precisely where Lily's ancient, green Chevy truck usually sat was a massive white moving van, its back doors open like the gaping maw of some cold, metallic beast. The engine was already idling, sending out the smell of diesel that Jake had faintly caught the night before. His stomach dropped, colder and heavier than the creek stone in Lily's hand. The finality of the sight hit him like a physical blow. He didn't move. He stood on the porch, watching as 2 heavy-set men, not Ben, her cousin, but professionals, came out carrying the last, large piece of furniture, a bulky wooden armoire that Jake recognized from the corner of her living room. The men were shouting directions to each other, their voices rough and distant. The noise was invasive, a terrible racket that desecrated the quiet ritual of his mornings. Where was Lily? He scanned the yard desperately, looking for the familiar shape of her silhouette. He saw May, her grandmother, frail and leaning heavily on a cane, being helped into the front cab of the truck by one of the movers. Her face was pale, drawn, and full of a terrible, quiet sorrow. But there was no sign of Lily. Jake's mind raced back through the thousands of notes he had played, searching for a warning, a chord he had missed, a lyric the guitar had whispered that he had failed to translate. The waiting song. It had been a song of goodbye, and he, the musician, had been the last to know its meaning. He felt a profound sense of failure, not just as a silent lover, but as a keeper of the town's secret rhythm. The movers finished securing the load and slammed the truck doors shut with a thunderous clang. The sound echoed down the lane, a brutal, definitive period mark at the end of their story. The driver climbed into the cab. Jake still hadn't moved. He was rooted to his spot, the coffee in his mug now cold. He saw the driver check his mirrors. Then slowly, carefully, the massive white truck began to pull away from the curb. It rolled onto the red dust of Harmony Creek Lane, its heavy tires crushing the small patches of new grass. Just as the truck straightened out, Jake saw a flash of movement. Lily. She was sitting in the passenger seat of the truck, beside her grandmother, leaning forward slightly. Her head was turned back, looking not at him, but at his house, at his empty porch swing. He couldn't see her eyes, but he felt the weight of her gaze. A deep, silent communication crossing the space between them one final time. It was a look of deep regret, of gratitude, and of a sorrow too immense to be voiced. He tried to lift his hand, just a small, simple wave, but his arm felt leaden, paralyzed by the weight of the moment. The white truck accelerated, slowly at first, then with more power, kicking up a great, swirling cloud of red dust that swallowed Lily's house entirely. Jake stood watching the cloud hang in the humid air, shimmering in the growing heat of the day. The house itself was still there, but it looked vacant, haunted, the windows like empty eyes staring out at the devastation. When the dust finally began to settle, revealing the stark, quiet emptiness of the yard, the silence was overwhelming. It was a new kind of silence, the absence of a known presence, a silence that hurt the ears. The mechanical roar of the moving van had faded into the distant hum of the highway, a sound that now seemed cruel and mocking. Jake walked slowly into the living room, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and retrieved his guitar. He sat down on the floor, ignoring the swing, and rested the instrument on his knee. He ran his callous thumb over the strings, producing a dull, flat thud. The music was gone. Not the memory of it, but the need, the purpose. He realized then that he had not been playing for himself, not really. He had been playing for Lily, and now that her quiet, patient ear was gone, the inspiration, the heart of the song, had been pulled out of him like a stubborn root. The folktale says that the deepest magic is always contained in the simplest, most consistent actions. For 2 years, Jake's daily song had become the spiritual center of that part of Harmony Creek. Now, with the rhythm broken, the entire lane seemed to suffer. The leaves on the oaks seemed duller, the water in the creek ran lower, and the cicadas, usually so loud, were subdued, their song hesitant. Old Man Silas, who had lived on the lane for 80 years and knew the rhythms of the earth better than anyone, stopped by later that afternoon. He didn't say anything at first, just sat on the porch swing, which creaked mournfully under his weight. He looked across the lane and back at Jake. "Miss Lily gone, eh?" he said finally, his voice raspy like dry river stones. Jake could only nod, his throat too tight for speech. Silas nodded, too. Knew it was coming. Been seeing signs. That old Hawthorne house, it held a lot of quiet, but quiet don't like to stay in one place long. It always needs to move on. Find new ears. Silas rubbed the wood of the swing with his thumb. "Your music," he continued, looking Jake straight in the eye. "It wasn't just pretty noise, boy. It was the spell holding that place still. When you stopped last night, even for that second, the spell broke, and the house let go of its hold on her. You gave her the send-off she needed, Jake. A beautiful one." This explanation, that his music was not a failure but a final, powerful act of release, began to soothe the ache in Jake's chest. The song had been a gift, a promise of freedom wrapped in a melody of longing. He looked at the lane, usually a simple stretch of red dirt, and saw it now as a dividing line between two fates. His fate, tied to the land and the memory, and Lily's fate, tied to the road and the future. Silas eventually left, the sound of his model a coughing and sputtering down the lane sounding almost mournful. Jake picked up his guitar, but he didn't play. He just held it, tracing the worn edges of the mahogany body. He realized the greatest conflict wasn't with Lily, but with the quiet destiny of his small life, which demanded he stay put while the love of his life drove away. That evening, the first evening without Lily, felt endless and wrong. The twilight came, but it lacked its usual purpose. The shadows stretched long and thin, but there was no counterpoint of light on the other side. The chair on Lily's porch was empty, the windows dark, reflecting only the desolate, growing darkness of Jake's own house. He sat on the swing again, the silence pressing down on him until he felt he couldn't breathe. He picked up the guitar, but the wood felt heavy and cold. He tried to play the waiting song, but his fingers felt clumsy, and the melody was flat and hollow, like a bell with its clapper removed. The music needed her silence to make it whole, and without it, it was just noise. He put the guitar down and walked down the steps, crossing the red lane. He stood on her property, something he had never done before. The dirt was smooth, freshly raked where the truck tires had spun, and the smell of honeysuckle was truly intoxicating now, as if the plant was trying to hold onto the memory of Lily's presence by intensifying its scent. He walked up to the dark porch and looked through the glass of the window. The interior was stark, the walls marked with pale squares where pictures had once hung. But on the sill of the window where Lily always sat, he saw something small and glinting in the faint residual light. He reached out and pushed the screen door open. It didn't screech or stick, but opened smoothly, quietly, as if waiting for him. He reached inside and picked up the object. It was the small, polished creek stone he had given her when they were children. It was warm from her hand, and next to it, tucked beneath the stone, was a single folded piece of paper, a letter. His heart began to pound a frantic, hopeful rhythm against his ribs, a sound far louder and more vital than any music he had played. He turned and walked back across the lane to the light of his own porch, his hands trembling. The note felt like a priceless artifact, a treasure unearthed from the ruins of their unspoken romance. He sat down on the swing and held the letter to the light, taking a deep, shuddering breath before breaking the seal. The letter was short, written in Lily's neat, slightly slanting hand. It was simple as everything between them had been. Jake, I couldn't say goodbye. This move is for May. She needs a place closer to specialized doctors. I listened to your song last night. I knew it was special. I listened to every single note for 2 years. They are locked inside me now. They are the only home I'll ever carry with me. Don't stop playing. Play for the land, for the creek, for the silence. They need it too. And thank you for all the words you never spoke. Lily, that was it. No address, no phone number, no promise of a return. Just a validation. Jake reread the letter 3 times, letting the simple, declarative sentences sink into his soul. The knowledge that she had truly heard him, that she had understood the deepest, most complicated parts of his silent heart, was a powerful, devastating solace. The letter was less about their future and more about their past, a beautiful conclusion to the chapter they had shared. He took the creek stone and put it into his own pocket, replacing the secret she had carried with a truth he now owned. The old folktale began to weave itself around this moment. The musician who played for the silence and the girl who carried his music across state lines. The silence in the days that followed was a tangible thing, a solid block of absence that Jake had to learn to live within. He went about his chores, mending the fence, feeding Bo, cleaning the perpetual red dust off the porch, but everything felt muted, like watching the world through thick, stained glass. The simple comfort of their routine was gone, replaced by a deep-seated suspicion of all things predictable. He found himself looking at the things he had always taken for granted, the slow crawl of the sun, the predictability of the seasons, with a new, weary detachment. He missed the tension, the sweet, agonizing suspense of their unspoken affair. The conflict now was internal. How to keep playing when the muse was gone. He remembered Lily's final instruction. Don't stop playing. Play for the land, for the creek, for the silence. It was a mandate, a challenge to take his music from the personal to the universal. He realized his love for her had not been a possessive need, but a profound inspiration, and true inspiration never truly leaves. It just changes shape, like a cloud passing overhead. The idea that the music must continue began to take on the weight of a sacred duty. The old storytellers in Harmony Creek always said that the land needed songs, just as much as it needed rain, to keep its heart beating. If he stopped, perhaps the creek really would run dry, or the oaks would drop their leaves too soon. So, Jake picked up his guitar again. That evening, he sat on the swing as the sun dipped, just like always. But this time, he looked out at the empty space where Lily's presence used to be. He didn't play the waiting song. Instead, he played a new piece, something simpler, cleaner, with a rhythm that felt like walking down a long, open road. It was a song about distance, about the courage it takes to leave a quiet place, and about the deep, true love that allows a person to let go. He played not to reach Lily, but to send his strength after her, a sonic blessing carried on the evening breeze. The music was less fraught, less desperate, and more profound, filled with the vast, quiet expanse of the southern night. The new music, the road song, became the new routine. The tension was gone, but the creative synergy was stronger. He was no longer playing to Lily. He was playing from the memory of her, and the absence had clarified the sound, stripping away his own fear and leaving only the pure, clean emotion. The neighbors, who had always kept a respectful distance from his private porch ritual, began to listen more openly. Old Man Silas would sit on his own porch, tapping his foot in time. Mrs. Gable, 2 houses down, would open her window just a little wider. The music now belonged not just to Jake and Lily, but to the entire lane. It became the soundtrack of their collective quiet lives, a reminder that even in a dusty, forgotten place, great love could bloom and leave a beautiful, lasting impression. The music was no longer a plea. It was a statement about permanence in the face of change. The profound stillness in Lily's house across the lane, the total lack of human presence, began to affect Jake in a strange, subconscious way. He started to view the house itself not as a building, but as a silent monument to her memory, a receptacle for the echoes of his past songs. In the twilight, the way the shadows gathered around the front steps, the townsfolk began to notice the shift in Jake's playing, and a new mythology began to form around the silent house and the lone musician. They called the house the listener, and Jake's new nightly performance, the lullaby for the listener. Children were told that if they were very quiet near the house in the evening, they could hear the memories the house was holding. The simple folktale was evolving. It wasn't just about a boy and a girl anymore. It was about the power of music to ground a place, to keep the quiet heart of Harmony Creek beating. Jake, unaware of the legend he was creating, simply continued to play his road song and its variations, pieces that spoke of vast distances and the strange way that love, when truly felt, could travel farther and faster than any moving van. One hot afternoon, nearly 3 months after Lily left, a terrible drought settled over the county. The creek slowed to a trickle, the red dust turned into a fine, choking powder, and the summer heat became unbearable. The atmosphere in Harmony Creek was thick with worry. Old Man Silas warned that the land was holding its breath because the spirit of the place felt restless. He came to Jake's porch not asking him to play, but simply offering a grim assessment. The earth, it's angry, boy. It's thirsty. And the silence is too loud. Jake felt the pressure. His music, once a private conversation, was now implicitly tied to the welfare of the community. It was the ultimate, strange conflict. His personal grief was now a public responsibility. He needed to play a song that could pierce the dryness, a melody that could conjure rain and settle the land's unease. That night, Jake sat on the swing, his hands sweating on the mahogany neck of the guitar. He tried to play the road song, but the notes felt dry and brittle. He looked at Lily's silent house, at the dusty, empty flower boxes, and he thought about the creek stone in his pocket, cool against his palm. He realized the earth needed not a song of distance, but a song of return, a song of deep, wet memory. He closed his eyes and started a tune unlike any he had ever played. It began with a deep, slow bass note, repeating like a heartbeat, followed by a high, shimmering treble that sounded like distant, approaching thunder. He was playing the sound of water, the drip, the rush, the steady, rhythmic fall of rain on a tin roof. He played with fierce intensity, pouring his entire subconscious longing for Lily's presence into the musical depiction of the storm. It was a song of deep, emotional evocation, a prayer offered to the parched earth and the absent muse, a perfect, agonizing blend of personal grief and communal need. He played for what felt like hours, his shirt soaked with sweat, his fingers flying across the frets in a complicated, frantic rhythm. The song became a torrent, a musical downpour that filled the entire lane. He reached a climax, a chord that felt like a lightning strike, and then the music abruptly died, cut off in mid-flight. He sat there, panting, the silence ringing in his ears, and then he heard it. Not the whisper of memory from the house, but a real physical sound. A loud, unmistakable thump from Lily's front yard, followed by a slight metallic scraping. Jake froze, his heart slamming against his ribs. He looked across the lane, and the scene was exactly the same. Dark porch, still windows. But the sound was real, a definite external event. The suspense was unbearable. Had Lily returned? Was it a thief? Was it the house, finally giving up its secret? He put the guitar down and walked slowly off his porch, across the lane, his footsteps muffled by the thick dust. The hair on the back of his neck prickled. He reached Lily's porch and saw nothing out of the ordinary. He walked down the steps and started toward the side of the house, where the old flower boxes stood, there wood splintered and dry. As he rounded the corner, he stopped dead. He saw a shovel leaning against the wall, its blade covered in fresh, dark earth, and a small, shallow hole dug directly beneath the bare patch of soil where the petunias had been. The smell of the turned soil was sharp and sweet, a contrast to the dry air. He approached the hole cautiously, and there, tucked into the dark earth, was a single, small, hand-painted wooden sign. The sign was simple, painted in white script on a dark piece of wood. "This is where the music lives." Jake stood there in the dark, the small sign in his hands, feeling the rush of overwhelming emotion. It wasn't Lily. It was her cousin, Ben, or maybe her grandmother May, who had left a final, physical trace of their bond before they completely vacated the property. It was a message that transcended their personal love. It confirmed that the music had taken root in the actual ground. It was an ultimate piece of creative synergy. Jake walked back across the lane, feeling lighter than he had in months. The crisis of the drought and the crisis of the silence were momentarily lifted. He sat back on his swing and picked up the guitar. He played the road song, but it was infused with a new confidence, a deep-seated happiness that sounded like a certainty. He played for the sign he had buried, for the house that listened, and for the distant girl who carried his tune in her heart. He played until the air turned cold and the moon was high. And as he played the very last chord, Jake lived out his life on Harmony Creek Lane, never marrying, never leaving. He became Jake, the musician of Harmony Creek, known for the quiet, soulful tunes he played every evening at twilight. He still had the creek stone in his pocket, worn smooth by years of worry and comfort, and the memory of Lily was the constant, true note in all his music. The house across the lane eventually sold, and new families moved in, but they knew better than to disturb the rhythm. They simply took their seats on the porch, waiting for the sun to dip and the music to start. The folktale passed down through the generations changed slightly with each retelling, but the core remained the same. A man played a song of love so true and so deep that it bound his heart to the land, and the melody he played for the girl who left became the lullaby that kept the whole valley dreaming of rain and return. He never saw Lily again, but one evening, decades later, when his hair was white and his fingers were stiff with age, he was playing a gentle, slow piece, a variation of the waiting song, when a beautiful, kind-eyed young woman pulled her car over on the dusty lane. She sat there in the driver's seat until the song finished. Then she smiled, a sad, familiar smile that reminded him instantly of Lily. She didn't speak. She just nodded once, gently, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging a profound debt, and drove on. Jake knew, deep in the warm, quiet space of his subconscious, that the melody had found its way back to its source, carried on the heart of Lily's own child. A final, beautiful affirmation that the porch song was never lost, only traveling. He stopped playing a few years later, not from illness or sadness, but simply because the cycle was complete. The house across the way was holding the rhythm perfectly now, humming with the thousands of songs it had internalized. On the day Jake died, the people of Harmony Creek Lane came out onto their porches. They didn't mourn loudly. Instead, they sat in the quiet twilight, and for the first time since Jake started playing, they heard the true sound of Harmony Creek. The soft rustle of leaves, the gentle croak of a bullfrog, and the deep, rich silence, now filled forever with the sound of Jake's porch song.